Hey, what's up, guys? Meteorologist Stormcat 5 here in the Weather Center. I'm here joined by Dr. Hobgood, who is a hurricane expert, also was my professor in college. We wanted to do an analysis on Hurricane Helene and why it was so bad and what the people of North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida, and Georgia are still dealing with today from this devastating hurricane. Let's get right into it. So first, Dr. Hobgood, I want to take a look at the landfall of Hurricane Helene, which made landfall in the Big Bend of Florida as a Category 4 hurricane. What we're looking at on screen right now is a radar loop of Hurricane Helene as it made landfall, or as it was about to make landfall along the Big Bend. We saw a lot of the numbers that said this thing didn't necessarily verify. It had winds of 100-mile plus. The latest advisory of Helene going up to landfall was about 140. I don't know if you have an opinion on Hurricane Helene. We know it was a Category 4 and it made landfall, but was there, like, from what you saw, did a lot of the wind measurements verify at landfall, or was a little bit lower than I think people expected?
Well, I think in terms of the intensity, Helene was as advertised. I think it's important to remember the Hurricane Hunter measurements are over water. Land-based measurement stations often don't record winds quite that high. But I think Helene was a very legitimate Category 4 hurricane, intensifying at the time of landfall. And you can see all the lightning there in the northwestern eye wall. I mean, that every indication of a very strong hurricane.
What a lot of people need to remember is that there's friction, right? There's buildings, there's trees, there's things that slow the wind down. So, a lot of the wind speed is always going to be stronger over water, right? Because there's nothing blocking it. But as soon as that hurricane moves onshore and we start to sample a lot of these wind speeds, oftentimes they're a little bit less. So this was still a Category 4, a dangerous Category 4 hurricane that made landfall in the Big Bend. So now, Dr. Hobgood, I want to start with the storm surge as well, because that was a very, probably the most impactful thing about Hurricane Helene, and really most hurricanes, is the storm surge. And there was catastrophic storm surge that was forecasted for Hurricane Helene. And looking at the data, a lot of these numbers verified, right? I mean, we did have storm surge of 3 to 5 feet down in Charlotte Harbor and Fort Myers and Naples. Actually, Naples and Fort Myers got the second most surge they've seen in a long time. They had more surge during Helene than Hurricane Irma, which was a direct hit by a Category 3 hurricane. That was a very bad hurricane. It was a Category 5 in the Keys, and I mean, this is the fact that these areas, I've seen such crazy surge with this, is not unheard of, but the west coast of Florida was just ravaged by storm surge. I mean, Tampa Bay, and Dr. Hobgood, you can probably talk a little bit more about this, but Tampa Bay got record surge as well. They were almost 200 or 300 miles outside the center of Hurricane Helene, and they got almost 8 feet plus of storm surge in parts.
Helene was just in the right place to drive the water into Tampa Bay, because after the center moved north of Tampa, the wind swung around to the southwest, and that just pushed the water right up into Tampa Bay. And so a number of places around Tampa Bay actually saw record storm surges.
We're looking at this, and this was the forecast that the National Hurricane Center put out before Helene made landfall. So Charlotte Harbor very clearly, Charlotte Harbor very clearly 3 to 5 feet of storm surge. Down in Marco Island in Naples, Fort Myers, you guys had 3 to 5 feet of storm surge. Tampa Bay had 5 to 8 feet plus of storm surge in parts. Caloosahatchee, now we're getting up to about the 15 to 20 feet range. 10 to 15 feet was the forecast of Caloosahatchee. They had almost 11 feet in Cedar Key, which was just to the north, maybe a little bit more than 11 feet. And then up in the Big Bend, they had 15 plus feet of storm surge. Guys, that is above normal. That is the water level above normally dry ground. So along the Big Bend of Florida and the entire West Coast, they woke up the next day to a completely different cities, completely different towns. Everyone along the West Coast felt the impacts of this. And the further north you went, the more catastrophic it was. Tampa Bay, St. Petersburg, Clearwater, those folks have not seen this kind of storm surge in a long time. And a lot of these people along the coast had their homes completely flooded. And then even further north, they had homes completely swept off the foundation. because when you have 15 feet of water coming on shore, there's just the infrastructure can't withstand it. So it's devastating impacts all the way from all the way down to Fort Myers, all the way up to the Big Bend of Florida, where we had significant damage and that they're just now starting to deal with. Now I want to talk about the power outages because we still have hundreds, if not millions, of people without power across the United States. I think the last time we had looked 5 days after landfall, we still have 1.6 million people without power. One of the craziest things to me, and because we're going to start to switch gears now, because we've talked a lot about Florida, I do want to talk about North Carolina, South Carolina, and those regions, is the amount of people that are still without power in North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. Folks that still don't have power by, in large part, is South Carolina, North Carolina, where we still have hundreds of thousands of people without power. That is one of the craziest things to me, and maybe Dr. Hogwood, you can talk about that. But you would expect the further you get away from the coast, the more the less the impacts are going to be in terms of power outages, just because the winds are going to decrease. But in this instance, I mean, Florida has come back, and a lot of people are getting back power. But the further north you go, the more people seemingly don't have power.
Right. I think there are a couple of things going on, and this holds true for northern Florida as well. I mean, there are a lot of trees in some of those areas, and Helene hit at the end of September. So there's still a lot of leaves on the trees, plus there are a lot of pine trees. You get strong winds, you're going to knock trees down over a wide area. You're going to take out a lot of power lines. A bigger problem, sort of in northern Georgia, western South Carolina, western North Carolina, and extreme eastern Tennessee, is the severe flooding. Because then with the flooding, on top of all the lines and the power poles getting knocked down, you've got flooding potentially getting into substations, knocking those out. And you've got floods and mudslides potentially taking down some of the big transmission lines that are bringing in the power from the power plant. So in those areas that were hit by the most severe flooding, a lot of the electrical infrastructure may need to be replaced.
Yeah, we're not talking about days, unfortunately, here. We're talking about weeks and maybe months to get the power on fully for a lot of these folks. All right, so Dr. Hobgood, now I want to talk about the flooding, because and what we're looking at right here is a radar loop of actually Hurricane Helene and the landfall. And I think a really interesting part, and you talked about this a little bit, like a PRE and what that is and what exactly happened during Hurricane Helene. But I think one thing I want to point out is look at North Carolina and South Carolina at the beginning of this frame. I mean, this is, and I'll just go ahead and pause it right here. Dr. Hobgood, do you just want to describe to us what is going on? Why, and why was North Carolina, South Carolina receiving rain well ahead of actually when the hurricane hit?
Well, there was a cold front that moved across the Ohio River and down into the southern Appalachians. And there was a flow of really warm, moist air coming up just to the east of that. So that region, eastern Tennessee, western North Carolina, northern Georgia, and it would soon affect western South Carolina, was getting heavy rain, thunderstorms, even before Helene approached the region. And we call that a predecessor rain event, and it can lay the foundation for really severe flooding when it's followed up by a strong hurricane or tropical storm. Yeah. And that's exactly what you see in the loop. I mean, you see Helene coming up through Florida and then moving over and dropping heavy rain over exactly those same places that got the rain earlier from that stalled cold front.
This is, the night basically of the 25th. So almost a day before Helene actually made landfall. I mean, they were getting heavy, moderate to heavy rain for hours and hours and hours, days even. I mean, look at this. Hurricane Helene still hasn't made landfall yet. And almost a full day later, September 26th, the evening of September 26th, they are still getting heavy, or light to moderate rainfall. But this just goes to show, I mean, they were getting rainfall days before Helene made landfall. And look, Helene still is just making landfall in the Big Bend of Florida. And this is, the night of the 26th, the Thursday, September 26th. That Hurricane Helene had just made landfall, but North Carolina and South Carolina had been getting steady to moderate rain for a day plus. And then watch what happens as this hurricane moves north. And finally, they get the brunt of it, right? And they almost get the core. I mean, the core of this thing actually almost went over decaying, but it almost went over top of them here. And that's when they get the heaviest rainfall. But I mean, that rain, it was heavy and lasted a long time, but I was out in a hurry. So the PRE, to your point, Dr. Hobgood, contributed significantly to this. And that stalled cold front that dropped rain after rain, rain shower after thunderstorm over the same region. And then eventually the hurricane tracked over that same area and still had pretty strong winds because of how fast it was moving inland. That knocked a lot of trees down. That, it really compounded the flooding issues that were already there. And then, we started to see mudslides and everything like that. But a crazy radar loop, Dr. Hobgood, for sure.
Yeah, I mean the stalled front, there was so much rain with that, it saturated the ground. The streams and rivers were already running high. And then you got the extremely heavy rainfall on the north side of Helene falling over that same region. And you add to that, the steep, narrow valleys in that part of the Appalachians. And you have a recipe for catastrophic flash flooding, unfortunately.
All right, so I think it's important to look at some of the pictures of the devastation. This was one picture that we saw on Twitter, and I want to spread the word about these pictures, not to necessarily be doom and gloom, but just to say, guys, the people of North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Georgia, they need our help, right? Because their infrastructure is gone, right? They have a major road basically washed away. A lot of these areas like Asheville and others are only accessible by air, right? So they're and to some degree they are building more roads right now as we speak. But some of these regions, some of these people are still stranded because of situations like this. Because think about it. Where are the roads? A lot of the roads are in the valleys, right? Because that's the flattest part. That's the easiest part to put a road. That's where that's where the towns are. And think about where the water comes when it comes off the mountain, right? It's funneling all into the valley where the roads are, where the towns are, where a lot of people are. So people have been devastated by this. And there are a lot of people that still need our help and are going to need our help for weeks, because it could be a long time before the actual infrastructure gets in place where people are going to be able to get access to clean water, to supplies, right? A lot of people can't drive to the grocery store right now because a lot of the roads are like this. And Dr. Hobgood, when you see these images, I mean, it not only is the flooding is bad, right? It is very bad, but it's also the fact that it's knocked out things like roads that are keeping people and keeping the help from getting to the places it needs to go.
Right. That's what makes it so devastating, is that we rely so much on ground transportation. I mean, we need those roads to get supplies, even everyday things. And also, you look at something like that, any water treatment plant along that river has been knocked out of service. So there's no water. So you're even trucking in water now. And if you don't have the roads, as you indicated earlier, the only thing you can do is bring it in by air. And I mean, I don't know exactly what this is a picture of, but I mean, I-40, a major interstate, is closed. And it's going to be closed for a long time because of the flooding and the erosion. It makes the recovery even harder when you can't just drive into a region.
Well, guys, that about does it for this segment. Please, guys, if you're watching this, you feel comfortable with donating, please do, if you have the means to, because for a lot of these people in this part of the country, this is their Katrina. We're seeing a lot of fatalities and just complete devastation that is going to take months to clean up. There's still people trapped. There's still people without access to clean food and supplies. So if you do have the means, I'd really encourage you to donate in some way. I just want to let you guys know that Stormfront Freaks are behind you. We are thinking about everyone in North Carolina, South Carolina, everyone that's been impacted, in Florida, Georgia, by this devastating hurricane. So please support if you can. But know the Stormfront Freaks support is fully behind you guys. This is Stormcat 5 with Professor Hopgood, hurricane expert. We wanted to just go into what happened, Hurricane Helene. We'll keep supporting you guys. See you on the next one.